right, let's jump into it. Hi, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to be with us. I'm Scott Stauffer, CEO of Scale Matters. And today we're going to run a little workshop style webinar where what we're going to do is share our approach to building kind of comprehensive go-to-market growth models that serve as really the dependable or a dependable foundation for our customers' annual operating plans. If you have questions along the way, please submit them via chat. My colleague Dan Quirk is standing by monitoring the chat, and he'll make sure that we address any and all questions. Before we get going, just a little bit about Scale Matters. We're a RevOps consulting business. We generally are serving VC and PE-backed growth stage and scale-up stage businesses. And kind of what's unique about us is, not only do we have the traditional expertise in go-to-market technology like all RevOps shops do, but we actually combine that with FP&A type expertise that has a lot of go-to-market savvy. And this combined expertise lets us serve our customers with what we call a model-first approach to RevOps. And what we've seen is that this approach tends to drive substantial alignment across their organizations, and the end result for them is faster and more efficient growth. And today, what we're going to do is walk you through some of the modeling approaches we use so that you can put these approaches in play in your own organization so you can achieve faster and more efficient growth as well. And although we're kind of sharing our tips of the trade so you can do this yourselves, obviously, if you think you need some help with it, please reach out. We'd be happy to see if we can help get you through this process. So let's jump into it. Annual operating plan. It really has two major components. The expense component, which is what we often call the budget, and then the revenue component, which when done right is fed from the go-to-market plan. And we often refer to the go-to-market plan as the growth model. For most growth and mid-market B2B businesses, the comprehensiveness of the annual operating plan is asymmetric. It's way out of balance between the expense component and the revenue component. And I'm going to show you what I mean by that. So the expense component tends to be very detailed, right? It lays out in some detail exactly where money will be spent for each expense account, for each department or cost center. This is a detailed spend plan. And then typically the actual expenses are tracked at the same level of detail to compare against budgeted expenses. Here's a very small example of a departmental expense budget where it identifies line item expenses for each employee, each contractor, as well as non-talent expenses such as office supplies, rent, travel, software tools, etc. These budgets or expense plans guide the functional leaders on exactly where and how they are expected to invest the company funds. By contrast, the revenue component is typically just a dissection of lofty goals, right, into monthly or quarterly sub-goals, and then an allocation of those goals across different departments within the go-to-market function. Typically looks something like this, right? We expect to exit this year at 23 million ARR. We're targeting to exit next year at 30 million in order to sustain roughly 30% growth. We'll assume 105% NRR, which means existing business should grow to just over 24 million. That leaves a gap of just under 6 million that we'll need to fill with ARR from new logos. We make some quarterly allocation of how that 6 million should be built out, probably based on some historical evidence. And then, based on these bookings goals, a 75-day sales cycle and a 4x pipeline coverage, we know we need to generate this much new logo pipeline by this time. And we're going to assume that marketing, is responsible for 52% of that, sales for 43%, and partners for 5%, though we would expect the partner contribution to come up throughout the year. This type of top-down revenue plan is insufficiently detailed to force and codify operating assumptions around how the revenue is actually going to be achieved, right? Like, what are the marketing channels and how much are we going to invest in them in order to generate that pipeline? What are we going to do from a CS or account management perspective to make sure that we actually realize that 105% NRR that we've modeled into this? What type of ROI do we need to have for each channel? And how does that compare to current performance? Because these top-down plans like this don't have that level of detail, the painful surprises we all too often feel are almost always on the revenue side of the annual operating plan and not the expense side. So this is, superficial, top down. We also see a number of companies that marry top down goals with bottoms up planning, but 9 times out of 10, they're doing this bottoms up planning, revenue planning based on sales heads. And this might have been effective, 20 years ago, when most of the pipeline was generated by sales prospecting. But that sure isn't the case now. And sales head driven plans are really just useless in all but a very few instances where sales prospecting is the predominant top of funnel strategy. Sales capacity should be an output of modern growth models, and I'll show you that in a little bit, not a driving input. So, as a result of kind of this superficial planning that is done from a revenue perspective at most companies, what we see is most miss. And it's alarming, right? The folks at Scale Venture Partners look at this stuff, and as you can see from this particular chart, over the last 3 years, more than half of companies are behind plan even after just one quarter. I mean, this is just terrible, right? And of course, misses on the top line are often correlated with even bigger misses on the bottom line in EBITDA, because companies are often too slow to react to these changing realities, and they're operating their expenses against their expense plan, but their revenue plan isn't coming anywhere close to what they had. So our goal today is really to share an approach that we have successfully used across countless of our customers to build detailed revenue plans. Again, what we call growth models that codify operating assumptions, and they tightly align with the expense plan. And while these growth models aren't going to guarantee, that lofty goals will always be achieved, they do tend to serve as a tool that enables leadership to much more quickly change course with a level of precision and intentionality that isn't possible with these high-level plans. Without these models, nobody gets a deep enough understanding of how the go-to-market engine actually works. In other words, how growth is actually achieved. Without these models, you don't have the ability to test different kind of potential investment initiatives to see what's going to have the most positive impact. And without really strong models, you're generally left powerless to have a very adult conversation with your board and your investors on cause and effect, and what it will actually take to achieve the goals. So let's get into what these models, how they work, what they look like. A growth model has 2 representations. At least in what we recommend. A visual model, which is also known as a context model, and then a mathematical model. And we're going to run through each of these. The context model is basically a communications tool. In our case, it is a visual representation of how a business goes about achieving growth. And we build these visual models because they're a lot easier to absorb and understand than the traditional spreadsheet-based growth model. And that's because they provide more context, hence the term context model. Let's walk through an example. Let me pop out of the slide deck. So we generally use Lucid to build these context models, but you could also use Miro or any other visual process modeling tool, even PowerPoint, right? The very first thing we're going to do is draw the core building blocks of the growth model. And we've already done that in this template, so I'm just going to expose that now rather than having you guys suffer through me actually drawing this stuff out. But in this example, we're using a traditional subscription business. And so this is a representation of a fairly traditional SaaS growth model where we're using an ARR waterfall to depict how this business grows. So for any given period, they have a starting ARR, which is then reduced by some amount of churn and contraction, which then gets moderated by some amount of expansion and upsell. These first four, what we call change blocks, these 4 blocks here, represent the dynamics that are happening to the ARR of the customer set you had at the beginning of the period. They work together to result in NRR, or net revenue retention. To the right of those existing business change blocks is the ARR that comes from new logos that are added during the period. And then the sum of the starting ARR plus the change blocks ARR equals the ending ARR. And hopefully, obviously, that's going to be meaningfully higher than the starting ARR, hence we call it a growth model. And by the way, this isn't specific to SaaS businesses or subscription businesses. All companies that are attempting to grow have a growth model, and let's say you're a software business with perpetual licenses and maintenance. Your starting revenue is probably your maintenance stream, right? And then you add to that either renewals or churn or expansions and maintenance, plus new perpetual licenses you sell in a period. So this concept applies to all businesses. Now, for each of these change blocks, let me make this just a little bit bigger. For each of these change blocks, there are one or more processes or motions or playbooks that we run that are aimed at optimizing the change in ARR. So in the cases of the red change blocks, we're executing processes to try to minimize the lost ARR. So maybe there are training, customer training processes in customer success to try to increase adoption, which will reduce churn, right? But there's QBR processes, right? So there are processes behind these red blocks that are trying to minimize the lost ARR. By contrast, in the green change blocks, we're executing motions or processes that try to maximize the increased ARR. And you'll notice here that in each change block, there is a letter in parentheses that corresponds to the tab with the relevant motion maps. So let me show you. So what we're basically going to do now is go from the very high level growth model down to what are the supporting motions or plays that enable that, right? How does the engine effectively work? So I'm going to focus on new logo motion. On this tab, we've drawn a motion that supports new logo ARR acquisition for this particular customer. Let me make it a little bit bigger. The left side of this is what you would kind of consider traditionally top of funnel motions, right? In this case, they have an inbound top of funnel motion that starts with website visitors. They also have an outbound prospecting motion. These motions converge at a stage that they use in an opportunity, which is called first meeting scheduled. Notice that each of these rectangles is a conversion process where there is some amount of leakage or fallout, which is identified by these trash cans. Each conversion process has an input and one or more success outputs and one or more failure outputs. And these conversion processes basically chain together to form an entire go-to-market motion. So progressing through this motion, this new logo acquisition motion from left to right, these guys have stages that represent first meeting completed, then discovery, then proof of concept, then procurement, then commit, then closed won. So at this point, let me just zoom out just a tad. We understand now, because we have this visual context, to understand kind of how many steps it takes to convert a prospect into a new customer. But kind of other than the labels on the stages, we really don't know what they entail and kind of who's responsible for them. So we're still missing context. Again, remember, this is why we call these things context models. So this is where we then add an annotation layer. And the annotation layer provides more descriptive context around each part of the motion. So, for example, if we zoom in on this first meeting scheduled stage, what we now know is that this stage, the responsibility for that is the SDR team. And we only exit that stage when we have confirmed acceptance of a calendar invite from the prospect, or in the failure scenario, where we don't get that, we lost the opportunity. And we do this annotation for everything in the motion that's necessary to give the viewer clearer context. And by the way, in the work we do with our customers, and if you take these templates and do this yourself, what you'll notice is that when you go through building out this annotation layer, it often exposes kind of real misunderstandings within your company in terms of how your processes actually work and who is responsible for what. And this often becomes the genesis for some very constructive conversation to improve processes. So now we know a little bit more. We understand ownership. We understand exit criteria, what it means to move from one stage of this motion to another. But we still don't have enough context to build a mathematical growth model, which is really what we want to get to from the perspective of annual operating plans. So to do that, we add an instrumentation layer to this motion map. And let me expose that. So these blue boxes basically tell us how we measure this motion, what we call the instrumentation. For example, if we zoom in on this first meeting scheduled stage, we see that it's instrumented in the opportunity object. Let me make this a little bit bigger. In the opportunity object, using record type equal to new logo, and it relies on the stage and first meeting scheduled date fields to actually measure the counts of first meeting scheduled. We see that the conversion step, this conversion process from first meeting scheduled to first meeting completed, is measured, has crystal clear definitions in terms of how we measure conversion rate and cycle time, right? Conversion rate is the number of records with first meeting completed date in the period divided by the sum of those records plus the number of records closed lost in the period that were closed lost from that stage. Only by having the motion fully instrumented can you begin to collect the actual performance data that you're going to need in order to inform forward-looking models that become the basis for your revenue plan on your AOP. Remember, it's just like weather forecasting, right? Models are a way to leverage historical experience to predict forward-looking outcomes. And as you can probably imagine, many companies suffer on predictability. And one of the reasons is because their historical data is spotty at best. And that's because they've never done the work to define the instrumentation strategy. This process that we go through is paramount. And I encourage you guys to do this. Everybody needs to do this, with or without Scale Matters help. But it's paramount to driving the requirements that will dictate how the CRM and other pieces of the go-to-market tech stack need to be set up. In other words, it provides the context. So, we do the same thing. Let me just back out. So this is what a completely mapped new logo acquisition motion looks like for this particular company. I mean, it looks overwhelming when you zoom out, but it's really not. It just is a effective way to present a lot of contextual information. We do the same thing for the renewal motion. We do the same thing for the expansion motion. And then what we do is basically layer those motion maps. If we zoom out of the core growth model, we just layer those motion maps onto the appropriate place of the growth model. And what you now have is a complete and comprehensive visual context model that helps folks to understand effectively how you go about the business of growing. So let's switch to well, actually, before I move on, let me just see if there's any questions. If anyone has any questions about these visual context models, now might be a good time, though you can also wait till the end. And if not, I'll hop into the math model. So again, before I hop into the math model, I just want to reiterate how valuable we have found this process of visual context modeling to be to create aligned understanding across the organizations of exactly how your go-to-market engine works. So let's pop into the math model for a second, or back to the slide. So the math model, the visual context model is really the foundation for building the math model. The math model is then where the leadership team is going to, align on assumptions, also do scenario testing and stuff like that to help prioritize the investments and forward-looking initiatives. So let's look at how that actually works. Just like in the context model, the math model comprises a series of conversion processes. Typically, we like to have the math model mirror the visual context model. In this case, I'm actually referring to a math model that is not related to the visual context model I just went through, but I think you'll get the idea anyway. If we first focus on new logo acquisition, so we're looking in this new logo bottoms up tab, we can see that their motion is represented by 4 different types of metrics. Volume metrics, which are indicated with the number sign or the pound sign. So total meetings set, total meetings held, pipeline opportunities, closed won deals. Conversion rate metrics are represented with the percentage sign. And cycle time metrics represented by the delta sign. And then if you scroll down here to closed won, you actually see some currency metrics that are represented by the dollar sign. Probably I should make this bigger. I apologize. So you'll now notice in this example, at least bottom of funnel, we're looking at a very simple process with just 3 conversion points. Meeting set to meeting held to pipeline opportunities, and pipeline opportunities to close won deals. Now, let me just jump back for a quick second to the visual context model so we can contrast the different granularities. Let me get rid of the annotation and instrumentation layers. So here, in the visual context model, it's much more granular. We have effectively 6 middle and bottom of funnel conversion steps and 4 top of funnel conversion steps, compared to 3 middle and bottom of funnel conversion steps in the math model. This is very common when folks first adopt model-driven RevOps. And that's because they use the visual context model to design and document their processes, as they are and as they want them to be, but rarely have they instrumented their tech to measure their processes, which is why the instrumentation layer in the context model is so important to basically identify the requirements of the tech, mostly the CRM, in order to properly measure the motions. In the meantime, they still do want to build a forward-looking math model as the basis for their AOP, but they're inclined or they're limited to the historical data they actually have. So the first year they may do this modeling exercise, it will likely not be very granular, but it's still a very valuable exercise to capture the operating assumptions. So in this case, and by the way, for these guys, they actually, while they don't have a very granular data from a process perspective, they do actually have it tagged by sourcing strategy. So they have captured their historical data across all four of their sourcing strategies. Let me get back up. Paid search and organic are the sourcing strategies driven by marketing investments. AE prospecting, obviously a sales investment, and then they have an investment in a partner program that drives partner referrals. So the first thing they do, or we do, is we capture the historical data, which is all shown up here in this particular tab. I'm not expecting you guys to absorb every bit of this, but you can see for each sourcing strategy, the conversion steps, what the historical data is. Month minus 15 is 15 months ago, and then 14 months ago. How much history you need sort of depends on your business. If you don't have seasonality, probably 6 months of history is fine. If you have seasonality, you'll want to go a little bit more than a year, which is why we kind of talk about capturing 15 months of history. So that's the first thing we do to build these models, is put the historical data in. Then we go to the new logo assumptions tab. And the first thing we do there in columns D and E is we do a summary representation of the historical data. In this case, we're basically taking the average over the trailing 12 months as well as the average over the trailing 3 months. You need to decide what's right for you. But why we're doing that is we're going to use one of these kind of summary representations to establish the baseline data that for the forward-looking model, what we call the N3M, or next 3 months baseline. In this example, we're going to set our baseline at the trailing 3 month average of the historical data. So now we've set our baseline. We know what the next 3 months of data is going to look like, because it's going to look like the last 3 months. And then what we do is we say, okay, beyond the next 3 months baseline, and by the way, you could just set the baseline for 1 month, right? It's whatever feels right to you guys. But we're kind of doing this on a quarterly basis. So beyond the next 3 months, how are we going to adjust those baselines? And that's where we have these adjuster columns, right? And next 3 months plus 1 quarter, plus 2 quarter, plus 3 quarter adjusters. And what you do here is this is when you have the discussion, leadership team saying, okay, what are we going to do differently that would cause kind of current business conditions to change, or current business outcomes to change? Maybe we're going to increase spend by 10% a quarter, right? And, so you simply put in the adjustments, quarterly adjustments to the baselines that you're going to use. We also highly recommend that you document why you made those adjustments, right? This is where you're capturing the assumptions for prosperity's sake, so that when you go back and you're trying to look at why things are off, you can actually relook at what the assumptions were you were making and the logic behind them, and start to decide, well, maybe that logic doesn't hold or whatever. So anyways, that's the next step in building out this thing, is to populate the assumptions tab. Once you do that, the forward-looking numbers, basically month plus 1, plus 2, plus 3, plus 4, automatically get populated, right? So I've probably overly complicated this thing. There's 2 steps. Capture your historical data, use some representation of that to decide what your initial go forward baseline is, and then capture your assumptions on how that baseline is going to change. The net result of that should propagate a forward looking model for your company for new logo. As a sidebar, um, new logo model tells you how many deals you should expect to have, each month, each quarter, whatever. We then use that together with this rep capacity model template that we have. And again, we're happy to share all of these things with you. So we'll email you, or you can reach out to us if we don't just proactively send them, and we'll send them to you. But this model, and I'm not going to explain it in great detail right at this moment, but it effectively combines stage to stage conversion rate with salesperson time spent in stage for each deal, and it ends up calculating the effective capacity of a salesperson of how many deals they can handle in a given year. In this particular example, the way it's populated, it says a salesperson can do 42 deals a year. So if we then go back to the growth model and we see we're doing 8.5, 8.7, getting up close to 9 deals a month. That basically says if it's 42 deals a year, we're roughly 3.5 deals a month per salesperson is the capacity. So this company needs to have effectively at all times just about 3 fully ramped salespeople. So that's how you should be using sales capacity. It's a derived output based on the bottoms up new logo model. It is not what drives the revenue. It is what is necessary to fulfill the revenue. So that's the new logo model. Now let me go on and talk about the existing model. This is how we basically calculate what the revenue from our current customer set is going to look like over the next 12 months. Step one, what we do is we capture the historical monthly revenue by customer. And we always keep this, we encourage customers to always keep this table up to date. Every month it should automatically populate. So this goes back 5 or 6 years. You're looking at monthly revenue for each customer. We also kind of identify when that customer became a customer, how we sourced it, et cetera. Beneath that section, what we end up doing is we calculate what's known as the gross retained revenue for a given customer. And what it is it's basically the lower of their current revenue or their revenue 12 months prior. And we use that then to automatically calculate retention. So you can see in this particular model, as long as you are populating the historical revenue by month by customer, it automatically flows out with logo retention, net retention, gross retention, etc. So that's the first thing we do. Then what we do is we repeat that process in this tab here, but we do that for each of the channels. So we're calculating the retention and an average deal size, et cetera, on a channel by channel basis, AE prospecting, organic, paid search, et cetera. So now that we know what the retention dynamics look like on a channel by channel basis, we can apply them back against the existing customer base, given what channel produced them, and that will actually propagate forward-looking revenue for each current customer that you have. So now we've gone through the new logo process of modeling that out based on historical evidence of how the go-to-market motion works. Now we've used sort of this historical revenue data method to predict future revenue of your current customer base. And then simply we aggregate those together. So what you end up with is kind of recognized revenue from new logo, recognized revenue from existing customers, and then total recognized revenue by month, total customer count, etc. So that's the concept of a very well built growth model, starting with the context model, the visual context model, and then translating that into the mathematical model. And, I can't stress enough, if you want to have an AOP that has a long shelf life and isn't a kind of embarrassment or joke come March 31st, it has to be built on a comprehensive and legitimate go-to-market model. Well-built models codify assumptions. Equally as importantly, they drive alignment across your organization around high impact growth initiatives, because that's where you do your kind of initiative and assumption modeling, right? And you could kind of figure out which levers we need to push. You then agree as a leadership team that we're going to do these initiatives that push on those levers. And guess what? Companies that operate this way end up with faster growth, and they end up with more efficient growth because everyone's pointing in the same direction. And just, again, going back to the two elements of this model, using the visual context model as the backdrop for the math model, it just improves understanding because it's an easier communication tool. Even though when you zoom out on these things, they look busy. You zoom in, it's a lot easier to understand what's going on in those visual models than zooming in on spreadsheets and looking at numbers. So we find that it's just a helpful tool to keep alignment and communication going. And it also has tended to be very helpful to help the board understand contextually when you talk about certain initiatives and things that you're doing, where in your overall go-to-market motion these things apply. So I'll stop there. Hopefully this was helpful. Again, open it up if there's any questions.
Scott, I was actually wondering about you used the vector of channel to look at retention over the years, and then you were able to roll it up, but on a customer by customer basis. But you're using channel as like the driver for that. I was curious if you could use another vector like product, for example, like the product they signed up for.
Absolutely. It's just that template was derived from a particular customer of ours that channel tended to be the primary variant in terms of both ASP and retention. I think what you would want to do is look at it and slice that by product, by channel, maybe by size, whatever dimensions are relevant to. What's that?
How about like AE or sales, the seller?
You could do that. Yeah, I mean, we absolutely see that some sellers are notorious for chasing bad fit customers. They might be easy to book, but they're hard to adopt and retain. So that's a good thing to do as well. And it just so happened I just used the example of channel here in this template, but you really ought to figure out which dimensions within your own business tend to see the highest variance on the retention side, and that's what I would use. For a kind of modeling wonk like me, I like to build models in all these different dimensions, but the reality is they take a lot of time, and so most companies aren't going to model out in multiple dimensions. So I'd just like to see them getting better at doing it in just one dimension, slicing along one dimension. All right, folks. Well, if there's nothing else, and I don't see anything on the chat, again, thanks for taking your time out. Hopefully this was